Hi, nice to meet you.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm not bad,
Welcome
thanks.
to Talent Matters podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Hopefully, it'll be a nice, good podcast.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, we'll see where we go. Tam, you're from Invictus Group.
Yes, I am.
Do you want to give a little intro to you? Or you don't have to if you don't want to. It's your podcast.
Yeah, I can do. I'm right. What do I say?
Where do we start?
Where do we start? So it's a long old road, but look.
Well, we're going to get stuck in that, aren't we? So, what do Invictus Group do?
We're recruitment specialists in the built environment, so engineering, facilities, and property. So they're kind of our three key sectors, and I lead the property and real estate function of our business.
Yeah, and you've been doing that for
20 years this year.
Fantastic.
I know. I said it earlier. When I said it back, it seems like a really, really long time. Really long
Just
time.
happens and goes like that, doesn't it?
It does. It does. Time flies when you're having fun.
Do you know? So Wave is 25 years old, and I will normally say 20 years.
Yeah.
And then I'm now starting to make sure I say 25 years, and that's even like that. I've just remembered 5 years,
Yeah.
or forgotten to add 5 years on. So it's
Yeah, it's pretty monumental.
It's a long time.
It's a long time, but I think it's also sometimes you forget how much you've learnt over that period of time and how things have changed in the market. And I think coming in here when I knew that we were going to have a chat, I was like, God, some of the stuff that used to be kind of normal trends in the recruitment industry, and now they're just completely.
And all right, let's dig into that then and have a little think. So when, of those 20 years, what have been the kind of key changes? Presumably, key change periods. Presumably, COVID was a big change.
COVID was huge.
What have you seen from in that period?
Do you know what? I actually think you kind of saw the post-pandemic reaction and everybody's view to the working world and flexibility and everything like that drastically changed. And it's kind of, I think in one way it was quite good that it just pressed the reset button, particularly within kind of real estate and that space, because I think you'd had massive occupancy in big office buildings, and a lot of people actually realised, hold on, we can rationalise our property portfolios and do something a little bit different. And then all of a sudden actually now the world has changed again, and we're noticing we had a lot of mandates come out in January of this year where some of our clients had said, right, actually we're going back to full 4 days a week in the office, 1 day a week from home, and it's kind of shifted again. And I think that's sometimes the beauty of the real estate world, is it just can change at quite short notice, and you kind of just got to work with it. And
that's such a short period of time. I was thinking about this the other day, that for years before COVID, the way in which people worked was relatively unchanged.
Yeah.
And then you went 5 years ago since COVID, and you had people coming out saying, right, we're never going into the office again. I always think some of the tech firms went, we're going remote forever. People looking at this building thinking, sell that, or give up the lease, saving loads of money. And that was a huge shift. And now it's kind of then it went the other way, and then I think it was the accountancy firms went, right, you're all coming back to the office.
Yeah.
That's all in the space of 5 years, giving up offices and now coming back. How's that impacted the role that you're playing in actually recruiting in and around this actual area?
I think it's made it a little bit difficult actually, because I think a client's needs sometimes are so different to what a candidate is looking for. And I think because I get it, 5 years, it does seem like quite a short space of time for things to change and everything like that, but it's created that precedent where people do kind of look at what they're actually doing and say, do I want to have that work-life balance? And I think it's definitely created a little bit of difficulty in kind of trying to convince candidates that maybe, you know, that is going to benefit them, and that it's the way that the market is now moving back towards. So I think because
you're getting people ask, you know,
yeah.
the roles you're recruiting for, this is an in-office.
Yeah.
Know, in I don't know what the exact.
In office.
This is an in-office role.
Yeah. So it's you know, and it was a mandate that came out from a lot of them, which was, you know, 4 days a week in the office, and you know, we challenge back on that, because it's, you know, well, if you're out on site and you're doing your meetings, you know, there's got to be that level of, you know, kind of flexibility. But it's just then managing that message within the market, because, you know, within our engineering business, you know, site-based roles, if, you know, you're working on a hospital site, or, you know, a stadium site, for example, and, you know, an air conditioning unit goes down or something happens, that needs to be physically fixed, and you have to have people on site to do it. So there wasn't really a huge shift in that side. It was more within the kind of managerial and the surveying side of things, where people actually had a lot more flexibility. And it's just pulling it back, and it's made it a little bit tricky to just help readjust that
what
market.
What are candidates saying when you're talking to them about
they don't want to do it? Is a lot of it. Why? I've got flexibility in my current role. You know, I'm doing 2 or 3 days a week, because I think they've had that longevity with their current firm, where they may have been working through the pandemic. So, you know, I think it's one of those messages that I think, you know, over time it will just become standard again, and it will become, you know, the way it is. And I think, you know, it's also delivering that message, I think, in the right way, because I think, you know, there are certain levels of, no matter what industry you work in, that, you know, you do need to learn and develop, and sometimes that only comes from, you know, collaborating and being in the same space together with someone that, you know, you can learn and bounce ideas off from. And I think because the real estate industry, it's so people orientated, you know, it's you always have some level of interaction, so it's just trying to manage that message in the
trying to keep it, kind of keep everybody happy in terms of going through that.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think it's also just, you know, like anything, you know, I think people forget that actually when you start a new role anyway, you whether it was pre-pandemic or post, you'd always have an embedding period of where you'd be sat somewhere for, you know, 4 or 5 days a week,
like shadowing,
shadowing and learning the ropes, or understanding how the business works, or how their systems work, or their induction periods, or anything like that. And I think it's, you know, they will still get that flexibility. It might just not be at that initial outset. And I think it's just managing that message in that right way.
And how was the kind of the market in terms of when, so your clients are who kind of big building companies, big property businesses?
So real mixed bag. So we work with property consultancies, we work with developers, we work with, you know, in-house organisations, you know, big, you know, the galleries, and, you know, anyone who fundamentally has some kind of real estate function within their business or operation, we work with them.
And has the roles that you've been recruiting for changed since, you know, I suppose what I'm trying to get to is that what, you know, pre-pandemic, there was just, it was quite cut and dry, I think, I don't really know, in terms of, this is an office, it needs to have these people in it, facilities, and then everyone said, no, sack all those off, we're going to work from home, so now we've got an empty office. Are the roles that your clients are asking you to recruit for, have they changed?
Luckily, not really, because I think no matter what, whether the property was vacant or not, it still needed to be managed. You know, there was still, you know, if you for example, there was a vacant property and had, you know, the air conditioning unit still in there, that still needed to be managed. Someone still needed to go down and inspect it and check that there wasn't, you know, any damage being done to the property or anything like that. So actually, they still needed some element of management. Yes, okay, you didn't need the size teams that you did, because there wasn't that need, but there still was an element of the same function still was required. So there wasn't, you know.
I'm with you. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for such a good answer. I just thought that it would have changed.
I don't know if that was an answer.
I thought it would have changed,
I waffled that.
but clearly not. So,
It didn't. Because the thing is, it's so difficult because, you know, people think, right, okay, pandemic, right, no one's in the office, and that means that we're gonna. What happened was businesses downscaled, but then you saw the rise of something different, which was like all this flexi space.
Yeah.
Because actually, then people were like, well, why do I need a 5-year lease on a commercial office block when I don't know what my business is going to look like in 5 years? So actually, I want something that's a little bit more flexible, and that I'm in a shorter lease, and I don't have the repercussions that, you know, if anything does happen again, that, you know, I'm going to be penalised with still having to pay rent on those properties, because whether they were vacant or not, whether you were a retailer and you were open or not, you still had to pay for all of the facilities that you were being provided. So it was kind of, you know, it still kind of operated. But you've always got in real estate, there's always something changing. You know, we've just had back end of last year, everything was kind of put on hold because no one really knew what was happening with the government, the economy, the wars, you know, I shouldn't say wars, the fighting that was happening around, you know, the political issues.
And I want to talk about this, you know, from an economic point of view. How is that kind of, you said everything was on pause last year. How is that kind of working its way out? Is it still on pause? You know, how
it's definitely everything's picked back up, because I think, you know, real estate has to be quite flexible in every sense of the word, because you just, you know, fundamentally it's
people need somewhere to go and work and live, and, you know, whatever.
Exactly, or to store their things, or, you know, whatever it could be. So I think, you know, any slight economic change has some kind of impact on the industry, and I think that's why there's always got to be that flexibility in the way that we approach our recruitment strategies, because I think it's, you know, you can't just always have, you know, the same candidates in the same pools doing the same things. You've also got to think about, right, okay, future planning and, you know, future proofing, and thinking, right, okay, well, you know, the market is shifting in a slightly different direction, and actually, you know, surveyors that typically did one type of thing are now starting to evolve and do slightly different parts of their role. So I think it's just always having that flexibility to kind of be able to, at the click of a button, just push of a button, just to react.
Recruitment businesses are pretty good at reacting to market needs, though. I think, you know, if things change, I think as an industry, the recruitment industry is pretty good at kind of adapting, more so than other industries. So I think that's, you know, clearly you've been doing it for a long time, and I realise that we've jumped straight into stuff that always comes up, flexible working and, you know, the economy and stuff, but we haven't actually talked about, like, how you got into the you know, into this
how
industry.
I fell into how I fell into recruitment.
You must have, because everyone I've ever met has all fallen in.
Yeah, but it's not. It wasn't. Do you know what? And it makes me feel very old. But, you know, it wasn't. You know, when I came out of uni, and recruitment wasn't, you know, a career path that, you know, was spoken about, you know, in any real vein, apart from, you know, you just apply for some jobs and you might get a call, and I genuinely fell into recruitment. You know, I graduated, didn't really know where I kind of wanted to position myself. I'd done some marketing, I'd done some business, you know, and economics, and I just thought I'll just apply for some marketing roles, and I got called by a recruiter, and I thought I was being interviewed for a particular company, and they invited me in, so I thought I was going in to, you know, potentially be a candidate for a future client, and it turned out that I'd walked straight into an assessment day. You know, had to call my mum on my lunch break and be like, oh, I'm not actually going to be back, I'm in another set of assessments this afternoon, so I'll be back about 4. And, you know, I've never looked back, and it was from that day that I fell into recruitment, same sector that I still do now, and it's been
amazing how that gets everybody, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, I mean, I never even knew, like most, that there was even a recruitment industry.
No.
Like, it was just a case, because you don't get taught this. There's when you. I mean, I'm not suggesting that they start doing this at primary school. And it's like, what do you want to be? I want to be a firefighter, police officer. I want to be a nurse or whatever. Do you want to be a recruitment consultant? That's just not going to kind of.
But they genuinely do. But they genuinely at now at school, they do talk about recruitment being a profession, recruitment consultants. This is your job. This is what. Yeah, they do.
Come on.
No
one's gone. That's what I want to do. You can scale. Buildings that are on fire and put them out. You can catch criminals, or you can save lives by administering medicine, or you can work in recruitment. Not gonna how do they even dress them up?
It's all because it's all part of changing that perception, isn't it? So it's like because a lot of the time when we have our internal people coming into our business, I'm like why recruitment? Because it was the first question that someone asked me, and I was like, well, I don't even know what recruitment is.
Yeah.
Like I'm not sure.
I came here for another job.
Yeah, I came, and it was as honest as that. Whereas now, people coming in, they know what recruitment is. They know what they want to do. They know what they can achieve. They know what the job entails, and it has definitely. I definitely think it's changed, because I think people do really now know that actually it is something that they can have a long-term career path in. And I still think there's probably work that people need to do to kind of, jazz it up and make it a little bit, I think sometimes a bit more glamorous, because there is that misconception that, recruiters are just out for a quick buck, or, just want to do the deal, and it's
people think it's just a route to easy money.
Yeah, and it's really more than that.
It's really difficult, difficult route to easy money.
Yeah, it is. The ups, the ups and downs are the real roller coaster of emotions, as I like to say it to some of our guys. It's you're never faced with the same thing, every day. It's something different, and it's a different situation that could and it. In one way, it's sometimes the best job in the world, because you're learning on your feet and you're exposed to situations that actually genuinely, I'm not sure you'd be exposed in many other walks of life.
Yeah.
But
So what's a good recruiter like these days? You're talking to people that they clearly know what they want to do. They've researched it. What are the kind of skills that you say to them? Right, this is what you need to be successful.
I think to be successful, it's a tenacity. I think you've got to have that ability to just keep going sometimes, because it can be quite tough. The level of sometimes rejection if a candidate doesn't want to take a particular vacancy, or the client doesn't particularly want to hire the candidate that you actually genuinely believe is going to be great for their company. I think sometimes if you haven't been in recruitment, I think for probably 5 years plus, that initial first part of that journey can be quite tough for a recruiter. And I think it's just sometimes understanding that, it's people we're dealing with, and people make wonderful decisions and different decisions that you probably sometimes would expect them to make. And it's just sometimes not taking it personally, still understanding where that candidate is coming from, or why that client hasn't chosen to recruit for that position, and still continuing to build that relationship and maintain that contact, and not think, right, okay, that's a 4 or 5 or a 10 grand deal that's just not going to happen. It's actually, right, okay, but why didn't it happen? And it still could happen in some other way or shape or form. And it's just never losing that, I think, that hunger to keep going, because I think that's sometimes the biggest thing that we see is, people give up and think that, it's too difficult, and it's not. It's about building a relationship, and relationships take time. And
it's a it's a longer sort of journey.
Yeah.
How did you find the market, generally speaking, at the minute, the market's quite tough. We're seeing less across the whole country. We're seeing less vacancies available, kind of month on month, and it's quite difficult. And there are a lot of businesses that are struggling a little bit, and they've got recruiters inside that business that joined, kind of, talk about 2022 quite a lot, but in the heyday, and now it's almost a return to how maybe it used to be. Has that been a factor in your business, or have you seen that across, your kind of other?
Are you talking in the sense of
network?
kind of internal talent, like competing against internal talent,
No,
or
just more? You said like some people are, they give up.
Yeah.
They're giving up,
Mm-hmm.
and I think now is a time when people would give up probably the most if they started in the industry. You said about 5 years. If you 5 years plus. Now, of course, it's about 3 years ago. The market went bananas. Everybody was like recruiting, all over the place. 1.4 million vacancies or whatever it was, and now it's difficult. And so now you're seeing people, not maybe in your business, but across the industry, that are giving up because it was easier 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think yes and no. I think a lot of it depends on the market and the sector. I think, with the industries that we recruit in, I think it's always been, because of that whole point about real estate and engineering needing that function to always be serviced on the property side of things. I think there's always been a level of recruitment that's continued throughout. I just think it's become so much more competitive with the way that candidates probably are engaging with us in the market, because I think the demands of what, a job or a company provides are so much more different now to what they look like 2 years ago, that I kind of think people were just going with the flow of, like anything, like I've worked through 2 recessions in the real estate industry, and it's like anything, it pauses and it stops and it always bounces back, because fundamentally, those needs are still there.
Yeah.
It just changes.
It's a question of time until
It is a question of time, and I think it's just about, doing things a bit differently. If it is that, we at the moment, one of the biggest issues that we face is just, there is a shortage of candidates in the pool of what we recruit for. Is it the way to tackle it is, we're trying to say to our clients, are you investing in your apprentices? Are you doing things a bit differently? So sometimes we're not just giving the recruitment advice in the sense of, right, okay, let's just fill this vacancy for you. It's actually, right, what are your strategies to change what you're doing to grow your talent, and how can we help to grow your talent, and how can we be an extension of what you do to attract those candidates? So I think it's just about, trying to do things a bit differently. But, we are, we're always, I think no matter what, if we're not competing against, your internal talent teams, there are other agents out there. And I think it's about, it's that quality piece that just, I think, will define, whether a business is doing well or not, because I think it's quite easy to, like I said, sometimes people will fall out of love with the job. I think the longer you've been doing it, you just kind of, it becomes just, bread and butter, and you face a different challenge in a different way. But I think it's just, I think the only thing with COVID is I think people, sometimes maybe feel, oh, okay, maybe I do need to do something totally drastic and totally different and change up completely what I'm doing. And I think that sometimes is just where that mindset might go sometimes, is because if it's not quite going right, rather than sometimes dig deep and, put the groundwork in, because actually we do need to change and do something a bit different or think outside the box. Sometimes the easier option is to just go, I'll just do something completely different and change. And I think sometimes that's just that's a time thing. I think it's
everyone's scenario is slightly different, isn't it? I guess, and it depends on where you end up falling on that scale. So I don't want to kind of gloss over your experience within this this length of time. So you were telling about when you fell into recruitment,
yeah.
The great trap that everyone falls into. What's happened after then? That's
it's a long time.
Yeah.
Do you want
We've
the whole?
ages.
Do you want the whole story?
No,
No, look, I fell into it, and I worked for some great people that I think made me fall in love with the industry. And then some of the clients that I worked with, I was genuinely, you know, I used to get excited about, you know, walking around London and looking at the various buildings and who was developing what, and, you know, how it all would come about. And it, you know, my journey just kind of continued on. You know, I started doing temporary recruitment, which, you know, was, you know, that faced different challenges to what I do now. I still recruit at the moment, and I don't think I would ever want to not recruit. You know, I worked and I started my career with Hayes, and it gave me a great foundation to, you know, the intros of recruitment, and I think probably that toughness that you have to sometimes have in the industry. And yeah, I went on to one other firm after that, and then, you know, decided that, you know, there was probably a gap in the market for, you know, a personalised specialist real estate recruitment business, and that's when, you know, we decided to open up Invictus 14 years ago.
And what can you remember of actually the kind of first year of
recruitment?
Of that? Yeah.
First year of recruitment or of Invictus?
Yeah.
It was, well, that was a recession.
Opened at the easiest time.
We opened at the best timing. But I think, you know, with anything, I think sometimes you got to take those risks, and you know, sometimes with great risk comes great rewards. You know, it was tough graft, but it was fun. You know, it started out with, you know, 2 of us in a small office, and it grew to, you know, I think it was 6 by the end of like the first year. A small little office in Surbiton that, you know, it was perfect for what we needed. And I think, you know, it was that hardcore sales. You know, there was a lot of calling and a lot of getting the name out, and you know, trying to create that industry presence that, you know, okay, we might have at that point, you know, 10 or so years experience in our industry, but, you know, we were going up against, you know, the big giants in our industry, and, you know, what were we doing different? And it was, you know, it's just trying to kind of work with clients that understood that actually they could probably get something a little bit different from us, and that their business really valued to us and it mattered, and we would go the extra mile to make that match come together. And I think if you looked at our business now, that still is there. You know, there's still that passion and that drive to provide that quality of service, because I think that's what differentiates us from sometimes our competitors is, you know, every bit of business matters to us because we care about our clients, we care about our candidates, we care about those relationships. And yeah, it's kind of it's a fun journey to have kind of looked back on, actually, because, you know, it was a lot of cold calling. I didn't realise how much cold calling there was at that initial stage. But it was, you know, just getting your market name out there and, you know, fighting tooth and nail to try and convince someone to want to work with you when, you know, you have no trading history. You know, you're not, you know, it's all those little things that people forget. You know, people forget when when you have to sign up to work with a big client. You know, they're going to look back on, you know, well, where's your resume of you know, here's your
where's all your case studies?
We haven't got any, and it's, you know, I did do this previously, and it's creating that market name, and that bit I think was sticks out.
And those values, they remain now within the business.
Yeah.
You mentioned when we talked about cold calling. Is that still, you know, there's endless debates on LinkedIn about, you know, whether or not cold calling is an effective way or not an effective way to win business. What's your view on that?
I think the market's changed so much. I think now
trying to get hold of someone's up, you know.
Yeah, I think the market's changed so much. I think sometimes people they don't rely on, you know, picking up the phone or going and meeting someone and having that conversation. I sometimes think that initial interaction tends, maybe I don't know whether people feel like it's a safer option to just email someone and send them some information and let someone make that decision themselves. I think you can't. I always think you can't get away from cold calling, because but I do think the market has changed. I think, you know, that now clients have set structures in place. You know, recruitment 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot more opportunity to be given a chance to get in and work with a business, whereas now I think the barriers to entry are greater. So I think sometimes you don't have necessarily that element of as much cold calling, because a lot of it now is more based on those relationships and the business relationships, as well as then the personal relationships that the candidates and the clients then have with the individual consultants. But you still will always have that element of cold calling, because if you sat back and just relied on vacancies coming to you, where's the real add value? Because I know if I speak to a good candidate, I want to go and represent them in the market. I want to be doing my bit to help them get their job, and that's not going to come from me sitting and waiting for a vacancy to land on my desk, because it may or may not happen. And I think no matter what you do, the only way you're ever going to get that achievement is by going out and calling on behalf of that individual and, you know, telling someone, why is this person so good for their business? Because that's where I think we add the value, and I think that's where we make that difference.
Do you think it's harder now than it was? I mean, removing the nostalgic value out of it, but like, do you think if you had to start the business now versus then, do you think it would be harder now? Why? Yeah,
I think the barriers to entry are harder than they were. I think the systems, the you know, internal talent teams, you know, they weren't really, you know, you'd maybe have one or two individuals internally who may recruit, but now, you know, you've got teams with pretty much every client we work with. They've, you know, a lot of them have got established teams. So I think that the models have changed within the clients, and I think it's now about partnering in a slightly different way. And I think, you know, it would be harder because, you know, that those structures have changed. So it's not as easy sometimes to just, you know, say, hi, I'm so-and-so from a smaller business that wants the opportunity to work with you. I think some clients would give you the chance, but I think it would be a lot harder.
And I guess the availability of candidates is so much more fluid, right? You know, I guess almost pre something like LinkedIn or whatever, you had a pool of candidates that recruiters had access to that employers, you know, kind of didn't. Whereas now it's so much more transparent and fluid, you know, there's not that kind of...
Yeah, LinkedIn is huge, and technology is huge in how recruitment's changed, you know, in the last, you know, 2-3 years. You know, it's constantly evolving, and there's so much investment going into it. And I think you've got to be aware of, you know, how that impacts what you do. And I think, look, fundamentally, it's got to be that partnership, hasn't it, between, you know, the good stuff that technology can do for you in terms of efficiencies and, you know, making things a lot quicker and easier for you to do, but actually you're never going to lose that, you know, that gut feeling that you get when you meet someone. You know, that will never change, and that will only ever come from that interaction and that behaviours and the relationship piece, I think, you know. So it's just about partnering those two things together and seeing how it goes.
I want to talk about technology and AI and that sort of stuff, but while I remember, because I forget, how do you talk about gut feeling, how do you know, like, how what is it that you're looking for? You speak to that candidate that you said you want to go out and represent, what is it that tells you this is someone I can definitely go and place here and here, and I've got 4 people that will already be interested? How do you know that?
I think a lot of it is being embedded in your industry, and I think, you know, knowing what people look for and having that relationship on the other side of things with your clients, that, you know, actually, Tam, I might look for someone in 2 or 3 months' time, and, you know, you're just constantly having those conversations with people and interacting in the market to just know when things are going to come up. But I think it's just about, you know, everyone brings something different to the table, and, you know, fundamentally a surveyor can do a set, you know, list of technical skills, or, you know, might have certain qualifications, but actually what they can bring to the table in terms of the added value stuff that isn't on their CV. You know, you're going to get that from building that relationship with them and just knowing through time, because you are an industry specialist and you've built up that level of knowledge, that actually there's something special in that candidate that they might have said which is totally unrelated to the technical side of what they do, but it's something that, you know, they could really make a change with a potential client that we work with. So I think it's sometimes just time and being that industry specialist and having been embedded somewhere for quite a period of time. You do just know sometimes, and sometimes it's just from having a conversation with someone that it can spark you in a direction that.
And you can, again, the experience of that industry. Do you think, it's another question before AI, AI is not going to be very interesting now, is it? But do you think that being the niche recruiter is the only way forward now? A lot of the, you know, the kind of, we recruit across all industries, you know, the big sort of high street, I guess, high street agency, you know, that's tend to be sort of, you know, batted down a little bit. So you have to have a niche, and the people that I'm talking to quite a lot have all got niches, and that experience in that industry or that sector is really the added value element for them. Do you think that's the way forward, or do you think there is a return for someone that says, I'll find you anyone you want across any industry?
Yeah, I think the market's totally shifted because it's not transactional, you know, and I think the businesses that do see, you know, their recruitment business as a transactional business, they don't see the wider bit in the partnerships and the added value, and, you know, the wider piece around growing the talent with a business. And I think that you know, the more you're embedded in your market and the more specialist you are, you're going to be able to bring certain qualities that, you know, a high street or a generic recruiter might not be able to bring to the table, because, you know, if it was that easy, everybody would do it and everyone would specialize in everything. But I think you lose that personal touch, you lose that specialism, you lose all of that industry knowledge. And, you know, I wouldn't want to go and do, you know, 6 or 7 different other industries, because I love what I do. And I think that's fundamentally why you then get sometimes the you know, I don't like to say the perfect match, but you get the great matches where, you know, people are with businesses and they grow and they develop and they help those organisations change, and
you know it's going to work.
And I think that comes from having that passion for what you do within your specialism, and I think that's why the niche piece is so important.
Yeah. Right, AI.
Yeah.
Any good?
Yes and no.
Brilliant. What an answer.
So yes, I think it's good in terms of efficiency, speeding up.
How are you using it? Tell me how you're using it.
Well, we're currently talking to a couple of new database type software systems who are talking about, you know, changes to, you know, how CRM databases work, and AI is being, you know, pulled into it. I'm not going to say I'm a specialist on it, because, you know, tech is definitely not one of my fortes, but, you know, we're looking at the advancements in the sector, because I think if we don't, you know, you will only stay in the place that you're in. And I think with anything, you know, you've got to be moving forward. So, you know, I definitely think it's great for certain parts of the role. You know, I think in terms of, you know, CV shortlisting, you know, pulling information out and being able to track it into a system, you know, great. But I think, you know, what we can't do is replace that interaction piece, because it's what I said earlier, you know, that gut instinct, that gut feel, you know, speaking to someone and understanding what they do. I think you're never going to lose, you can't ever lose that element, because AI cannot, I don't believe that AI could replace that piece, because
that seems to be the thing. Sorry to just jump in. That seems to be the thing that everyone is trying to replace. You know, with AI, you know, recruiters, and you know, why is everyone doing that? Do you think?
You know, it could be their sector. It could be, you know, the markets that they recruit in. I think, you know, where the property industry and the facilities and engineering industries are so people orientated, I think, you know, there's certain parts of it that could not replace what, you know, the traditional methods would replace. But I definitely think there are huge efficiencies that can be made from having AI into your systems and, you know, making life that little bit easier. You know, I also think, you know, sometimes does it make you lose that personal touch? Probably a little bit, because I think, you know, it's quite easy now to just go on and have a job description written for you, and, you know, does that portray what that client really wants? Does it tell you, you know, the added bit that they're looking for that, you know, AI is not going to recognize from an auto-generated, you know, job description? So I think it's just about, you know, marrying them together and actually saying, right, okay, well, that speeds my time up, so I'm going to get it to write me a job description, but then I'm going to actually spend time to read it and tweak it and put all the extra little personal bits in there that, you know, are going to make the difference to get that right match.
I suppose it comes down to what the candidates or what we as consumers want, you know, and what works for us, you know. So if there is an ad that's being written that doesn't have any of that information in, because you don't need to know that, or the candidate's not interested in that, then it's okay.
Yeah.
But quite often that's not the case, is it? You know, because they want to know, they want someone to be as interested and invested in their next move as they are.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Just willy-nilly applying for stuff is not quite what they want to do, especially if it's, you know, certain, all roles really, but like, you know, some of the professions, it matters kind of which employer they're going to, because they've got an opinion of which employer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think that sometimes that's part of our job, is to change perceptions on, you know, what someone might think of a firm, because, you know, what they might have been like 2 years ago is a very different situation to where they are now. You know, we talked about how quickly the real estate market can change, and it completely replicates itself within the team. So I think it's about, you know, just being able to sort of, you know, convince people that, you know, there is other factors that make up that whole piece around why someone's looking to move or why someone's looking to recruit, and what that looks like, because it's not just about, you know, the skills that are required anymore, or a, you know, an ideal tick list of what you want, you know, someone to do, or what the job is going to be entailing. It's much more about, you know, matching up the cultural piece, the values, you know, why someone's motivated to do something a bit different. And I think sometimes, you know, you can't pick that out just purely based on AI, and maybe it will evolve to be able to do that, which, you know, will be a completely different talking point. But I think, you know, in terms of, you know, the ease of being able to shortlist and, you know, get some of the more day-to-day pieces of work done, I think it definitely does. It does make it more efficient. Yeah,
I think you're right. That idea of when it moves on to another level, then it's a different thing. It feels a little bit like at the minute that it should be used for your benefit, or for, you know, to help get what you want done, rather than shove it in front of someone else and say, no, if you want to apply for this job, you have to speak to this AI robot. Or AI, you know, kind of.
But I think also, you know, where's that interaction piece? You know, if you're, you know, I get it, maybe it's a first wave of, you know, you use AI to screen and shortlist, but again, you know, what if it doesn't pick up, you know, because, you know, it can happen. What if it doesn't pick up, you know, one relevant word because it's not, you know, it's not embodied in the right way or whatever, and you could miss someone, or, you know, so I definitely think you could kind of, it can be used in ways to make the process easier. But I think, you know, you've got to kind of have that level of connect, because, you know,
you've got to speak, like you want to speak to, because actually we don't, and for a lot of things we don't want to talk to the human, right?
Well, just think about how frustrated you might get, you know, when you call up to, I don't know what it could be, you know, phone contracts or whatever, and you get put through to an automated, and you're like, oh, I just want to speak to someone because I don't understand what what I'm doing, or what this product means, or what this is, or what
Yeah.
that is. And sometimes I think, and I go, right, okay, but a candidate could be going through that same experience. They might not know. And I think this is sometimes the frustration when we speak to candidates, is they're like, oh, I applied to that company and I've never heard anything.
Yeah.
I got an automated response back, thank you for your application, and then there was nothing more than that. And it's like, right, okay, but there's a disconnect there. And if there was someone speaking to that individual, you may get a slightly different response.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the automated phone systems when you phone. When they say like, press 1 for this, press 2 for that, press 3 for that.
Drives me bananas.
And it's not just a couple of options, like 8 or 9 different options, and you're like, I'm really not sure which one, and then you go for another one.
Yeah.
And then it's another 5 options, and then it's another one. Then there's another 3 options, and then I always seem to hit the one that says like, you need to go online. Thanks for calling. Bye. And then hangs up on you. Like, that should be banned. That drives me insane. But
it's like, you just think, God, if, you're dealing with people's, huge life choices and huge life changes, someone's career, and a move can define where they go or what they achieve in the next 2, 5, 10 years. And I think, there's got to be a level of onus that, there are some things that, can't be replaced in terms of understanding that relationship. So I definitely think it's about just marrying it together and getting the best from both.
And we're irrational, aren't we? When we don't always follow the same path. What we want to do today might change for tomorrow. Talking about like those life changes, have you got like a standout kind of role that you filled, or a placement that you made, or something like that? Is there something that you think about, not that you will reference when someone asks a silly question like this?
I think having done it for 20 years, I've been lucky to work with some amazing people and some amazing clients, and you'll never forget your first placement. That's always a standout moment.
Yeah.
But I think the one that will always stick with me is, it was a post-pandemic situation actually, and I'd met a candidate probably maybe 2 years prior to the pandemic, and I just met them for a coffee, and there was no I'm looking for a job or anything like that. It was more just to build those foundations, to start those conversations that if I ever was to move, this is what I would like to do, and everything like that. And so hadn't spoken to them for a couple of years, had communication via email and things like that, and I got a call, and and she said to me, I'm in a bit of a predicament. I've been made redundant on really short notice. The whole team's going. The pandemic's really affected the team. It's being shut down, and she was in tears, and it still sticks with me now. I remember the conversation like it was yesterday, and I remember thinking, right, what can we do? Because she's a really good candidate and she's got some great qualities, but she didn't have any of the technical skill set that would be required to do a role that was actually quite safe. Coming out of the pandemic, there were certain markets that were really impacted. Agency, development, investment, all of those markets were hit. And valuation was core to still being, a busy sector. And I remember making one call on her behalf, because I remember just thinking, she needs to work for someone who is going to support her, and she needs to work for someone who's going to help her build her confidence, and who's going to help her grow, who's going to give her the time to actually know that she has got some great transferable skills, and she's got a base understanding of the market space that she could transfer into. And it was difficult because interviews were still happening via Teams. There was, she wasn't able to go in and meet them in person, and she got recruited. And I remember making that call to deliver the offer, and the joy and the tears and everything that came with it. And that's something that stuck with me, because fast forward a year on, she got promoted. She's still with the business. She's absolutely flying.
That's
and
brilliant.
It's now year 5, year 6, coming into year 6, isn't it? And she's still in that same business, but has really developed. And I just think that's why I do what I do is because it's, you know, someone who was at very early stages in their career, and a typical, you know, I believe genuinely that a typical recruiter would have said, oh, I haven't got anything in that space, the market's not busy, I can't really help you. But it was something that she'd said in a conversation that just stuck with me, and I was like, that's really cool, I have to get her a job. And
that's nice.
And so I still take pride that she's there, and the client, you know, has looked after her ever since.
Because you're impacting people's lives,
yeah,
and maybe sometimes it's just a job in a way, and it's just a you know, kind of another person that you've placed in somewhere else, but actually the impact that you've had has been huge. But maybe sometimes you can't stay like mindful of all of those people, but it's, you know, it does make a difference, and people do remember like, you know, the efforts that you go to.
And there's always I always think there's defining moments in your career over the years where there are standout ones like that make a difference and make a change, and they make you, you know, they make you really believe in what you do, because it is adding value. It is seeing the greatness in a situation and thinking, right, I can do something here. And it's what I said earlier, it's not about, you know, it's not about the transactional side of things. And I think if recruiters are sitting there thinking it is a transactional business, then they'll have short-term success.
Yeah.
They won't get the long-term success, because they're not really truly understanding the fact that you've got to build those relationships, and you've got to nurture them, and you've got to understand, and you've got to listen to what's going on in the market, and, you know, listen to some feedback, you know, because we don't always do it right, and, you know, sometimes we do get it wrong, and, you know, ultimately, you know, until someone's working in a job, you never know if it's really going to work out. So it's also then about the after process as well, and showing that care through that whole piece.
And kind of got to take it on the chin if it goes wrong a little bit sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes you got to take responsibility as well, because if it doesn't work out, you know, there's always something there's always some factor that's there in it. You know, we try to really teach our team to, you know, go above and beyond, and, you know, speak to those candidates, make sure that they've settled in well, make sure that they're happy, speak to the client, they're saying it's great, is that true? You know, and it's all that added value bit that is not just, it's not the transactional, right, let's just make the sale and go.
Move on.
And I think that's the difference between the short-term success and the longevity.
So what's going on at Invictus now? We were talking earlier about you had some success with Wimbledon.
Yes, we did.
So should we talk about that?
Yeah, so we've you know, look, we like to believe we're specialists in what we do. So kind of anything within that built environment in real estate and facilities and engineering is what we do. But I think it's the third year running now, we have retained to deliver the championship staff for the engineering part of Wimbledon, to make sure that, you know, behind the scenes that, you know, everything is running smoothly, and that, you know, during those championship periods that, you know, nothing goes wrong. And that's just one of the...
That's like the roof needs... So if the roof needs closing, you're going to need to make sure someone knows how to actually get that roof.
Yeah, or if you know, if the air conditioning units fail in, you know, the locker rooms of, you know, some of your your big superstars, you know, it's, you know, having that team in place that can ensure that whole championship is run really smoothly. You know, we do some major stuff for like some great hospitals, you know, again, and it's that bigger piece that people forget, that sometimes, you know, if a you know a NICU unit goes down, you know, with electricity, or, you know, the air conditioning units again are not, you know, or something happens in the property, you know, you've got to have that backup team that can come in and just make sure that everything runs smoothly. So, you know, we do some really interesting stuff, and we're lucky that, you know, we work with some really great clients. So yeah,
that's good. That's that's the third year running, did you say?
Third year running, yeah.
So clearly you said you like to think of yourself as specialist. Clearly you are.
Yes.
Like, you know, so, and doing a good job.
Yeah, and and you know, it's a difficult market, because it's you know, temporary cover, so it's, you know, for a set period of time, and it's having the engineers that, you know, can come in and not just fix everything, but, you know, walking around the site can represent Wimbledon.
Because they're different. That's a difficult role to recruit for, right? Because it's not, I guess, if you're taking an event, for example, there are companies that will provide the event staff that, check tickets and that sort of security, etc. And it's quite transactional. But these are people that actually
highly skilled,
skilled that probably would be in a full-time role, right?
Yeah.
So how do you?
Well, it's
That's why we're the specialists.
Yeah, it is why we're the specialists, and our temp team leader who runs that project every year, he definitely gets some characters, but it's that's part of the fun of it is just working with great clients and helping them deliver on such a massive project and then being able to just make sure that behind the scenes we're doing everything that we do to qualify and make sure that everybody turns up, and we have to adapt our recruitment processes so differently to anything when we run a project, so it's have to hone in and tailor and do things a little bit differently than sometimes we might do on a traditional piece of recruitment. And I think that's the nice bit about working with a specialist is that you get that flexible approach to be able to say, right, we're going to just put a project team on it and that's all they do, and they deliver it really well.
And are things like that part of where you're going in the future? Are you looking to do more of those types of things where you can, because obviously Wimbledon is one event, there's plenty of others, is that an area where you want to move into, or is it kind of nuanced that you just look after those guys and then when it's finished you do
no, it's definitely something that we're looking to really capitalize on and try and replicate with other clients. We do a lot of project work with clients anyway. When they mobilize a big building, there's a lot that goes behind that process, and sometimes we don't publicize enough that we've delivered on some huge projects for massive skyscrapers that have gone up in the city and Canary Wharf and wherever else it could be. So I think it's about maybe this year investing in doing more of the added value piece.
It's a little bit like recruitment that you when you were talking about it, you kind of don't know that it even exists. And I suppose a lot of the same for a lot of these buildings is that if you don't really look hard, you just sort of assume that, well, yeah, of course the aircon unit's going to work, of course this is all going to work, and it just magically appears, but clearly it doesn't.
It doesn't, and I think that's the thing is it's also about we've got how many ever square foot building, and we need to get it occupied. We need to get people wanting to rent the property and getting into that space, and how do we market that, and what are the agents that we engage with, and it's it's a whole piece that gets sometimes overlooked because I think people just assume it just is
just magic, just
magic, just poof, it happens.
Yeah. We're sort of coming towards the end now, but if we were going to go back 20 years, what would your advice to yourself be, as you started, 14 years, when the business started, what would you, if you could go back and give yourself some advice, what would that be?
Oh, that is a tough question.
I save the tough ones to the end.
Yeah, that's really tough. I think sometimes, in the early stages, it's not taking things too personally. Because I think, when it is your own business and, you're doing it with someone else because you want to create a better environment within the industry that you work in, I think sometimes you do take it personal, and I think probably sometimes it's just trust in what you do and just keep doing it. And I think having got to where we are now, I can kind of look back and think, actually, it was, the tough graft was worth it, but I think it was just maybe enjoy it. Enjoy that early stage a little bit more, because the journey is part of the fun and part of the enjoyment that you get. So I think it'd probably just be that bit.
You never quite know what's coming, do you? I mean,
never.
So I think it's like the benefit of hindsight is really brilliant, and what an amazing thing. But at the time, it's difficult not to take it personally, not to be too.
And I think that's that if I was going to give any advice to recruiters going forward, it's just knowing that just trust your gut, trust your instinct, keep going, and enjoy the processes and the fruits of your labour, because it is satisfying what we do. And if it was easy, everybody would do it. And I think just dig deep, don't give up, and keep going. Because it is rewarding.
Yeah, brilliant, lovely. Tam, thanks very much for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Too intense.
No.
So, no, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for